Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Reading Corner. I'm your host, Renee, and I am here for you every Wednesday reading stories from the public domain. And we are currently reading through The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey, written in 1951. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Chapter 10. What Stillington told the council on that summer day in 1483 was, Grant learned, that he had married Edward IV to Lady Eleanor Butler, a daughter of the first Earl of Shrewsbury, before Edward married Elizabeth Woodville. Why had he kept it to himself so long? He asked when he had digested the news. Edward had commanded him to keep it a secret, naturally. Edward seems to have made a habit of secret marriages, Grant said dryly. Well, it must have been difficult for him, you know, when he came up against unassailable virtue. There was nothing for it but marriage, and he was so used to getting his own way with women, what with his looks and his crown, that he couldn't have taken very resignedly to frustration. Yes, that was the pattern of the Woodville marriage. The indestructibly virtuous beauty with the gilt hair, and the secret wedding. So Edward had used the same formula on a previous occasion, if Stillington's story was true. Was it true? Well, in Edward's time, it seemed, he was in turn both Privy Seal and Lord Chancellor, and he had been an ambassador to Brittany, so Edward either owed him something or liked him, and he, on his part, had no reason to cook up anything against Edward, supposing he was the cooking sort. No, I suppose not. Anyway, the thing was put to Parliament, so we don't have to take just Stillington's word for it. To Parliament? Sure, everything was open and above board. There was a very long meeting of the Lords at Westminster on the 9th. Stillington brought in his evidence and his witnesses, and a report was prepared to put before Parliament when it assembled on the 25th. On the 10th, Richard sent a letter to the city of York asking for troops to protect and support him. Ha! Trouble at last. Yeah, on the 11th he sent a similar letter to his cousin Lord Neville, so the danger was real. It must have been real. A man who dealt so economically with that unexpected and very nasty situation at Northampton wouldn't be one to lose his head at a threat. On the 20th, he went with a small body of retainers to the Tower. Did you know that the Tower was the royal residence in London and not a prison at all? Yes, I knew that. It got its prison meaning only because nowadays being sent to the Tower has one meaning only. And, of course, because being the royal castle in London and the only strong keep, offenders were sent there for safe keeping in the days before we had His Majesty's prisons. What did Richard go to the Tower for? He went to interrupt a meeting of the conspirators and arrested Lord Hastings, Lord Stanley, and one John Morton, Bishop of Ely. I thought we would arrive at John Morton sooner or later. A proclamation was issued giving details of the plot to murder Richard, but apparently no copy now exists. Only one of those conspirators was beheaded, and that one, oddly enough, seems to have been an old friend of both Edward and Richard, Lord Hastings. Yes, according to the sainted Moor, he was rushed down to the courtyard and beheaded on the nearest log. Rushed nothing, said Carradine disgustedly. He was beheaded a week later. There's a contemporary letter about it that gives the date. Moreover, Richard couldn't have done it out of sheer vindictiveness, because he granted Hastings forfeited estates to his widow, and restored the children's right of succession to them, which they had automatically lost. No, the death of Hastings must have been inevitable, said Grant, who was thumbing through Moore's Richard III. Even the sainted Moore says, undoubtedly the Protector loved him well, and was loth to have lost him. What happened to Stanley and to John Morton? Stanley was pardoned. What are you groaning about? Poor Richard. That was his death warrant. Death warrant? How could pardoning Stanley be his death warrant? Because it was Stanley's sudden decision to go over to the other side that lost Richard the Battle of Bosworth. You don't say. Odd to think that if Richard had seen to it that Stanley went to the block, like his much-loved Hastings, he would have won the Battle of Bosworth, and there would never have been any Tudors, and the hunchbacked monster that appears in Tudor tradition would never have been invented. On his previous showing, he would probably have had the best and most enlightened reign in history. What was done to Morton? Nothing. Another mistake. Or at least nothing to signify. He was put into gentlemanly detention under the care of Buckingham. The people who did go to the block were the heads of the conspiracy that Richard had attested at Northampton, Rivers and Co., and Jane Shore was sentenced to do penance. Jane Shore? What on earth has she got to do with the case? I thought she was Edward's mistress. So she was, but Hastings inherited her from Edward, it seems. Or rather, let me see, Dorset did. And she was go-between between the Hastings side of the conspiracy and the Woodville side. One of Richard's letters existing today is about her, about Jane Shore. What about her? His Solicitor General wanted to marry her when he was king, I mean. And he agreed. He agreed. It's a lovely letter, more in sorrow than in anger, with a kind of twinkle in it. Lord, what fools these mortals be. That's it exactly. No vindictiveness there either, it seems. No, quite the opposite. You know, I know it isn't my business to think or draw deductions. I'm just the research worker. But it does strike me that Richard's ambition was to put an end to the York-Lancaster fight once and for all. What makes you think that? Well, I've been looking at his coronation lists. It was the best attended coronation on record, incidentally. You can't help being struck by the fact that practically nobody stayed away, Lancaster or York. Including the weathercock Stanley, I suppose. I suppose so. I don't know them well enough to remember them individually. Perhaps you're right about his wanting a final end to the York-Lancaster feud. Perhaps his lenience with Stanley was due to that very thing. Was Stanley a Lancastrian, then? No, but he was married to an abnormally rabid one. His wife was Margaret Beaufort, and the Beauforts were the reverse side, so to speak, the illegitimate side of the Lancaster family. Not that her by-blow side worried her, or her son. Who was her son? Henry the Seventh. Carradine whistled, long and low. You actually mean to say that Lord Stanley was Henry's mother? She was, by her first husband, Edmund Tudor. But Lady Stanley has a place of honor at Richard's coronation. She carried the Queen's train. I noticed that because I thought it quaint, carrying the train, I mean. In our country, we don't carry trains. It's an honor, I take it. It's a thundering great honor. Poor Richard. Poor Richard. It didn't work. What didn't? Magnanimity. He lay thinking about it while Carradine shuffled through his notes. So, Parliament accepted the evidence of Stillington. They did more. They incorporated it into an act, giving Richard the title to the crown. It was called Titulus Regius. For a holy man of God, Stillington wasn't cutting a very glorious figure, but I suppose that to have talked sooner would have been to compass his own ruin. You're a bit hard on him, aren't you? There wasn't any need to talk sooner. No harm was being done to anyone. But when it came to the question of the succession, then he had to talk, whatever kind of figure he cut. Yes, of course you're right. So the children were proclaimed illegitimate in open Parliament, and Richard was crowned, with all the nobility of England in attendance. Was the Queen still in sanctuary? Yes, but she had let the younger boy join his brother. When was that? Carradine searched through his notes. On June the 16th. I've put, at the request of the Archbishop of Canterbury, both boys living at the Tower. That was after the news had broken, the news that they were illegitimate. Yes. He tidied his notes into some kind of neatness and put them away in an enormous pocket. That seems to be all, to date, but here's the payoff. He gathered his train from either side of him onto his knees with a gesture that both Martha and King Richard might have envied. You know that act, that Titulus Regius? Yes, what about it? Well, when Henry VII came to the throne, he ordered that the act should be repealed without being read. He ordered that the act itself should be destroyed and forbade any copies to be kept. Anyone who had kept a copy was to be fined and imprisoned during his pleasure. Grant stared in great astonishment. Henry VII? He said. Why? What possible difference could it make to him? I haven't a glimmer of an idea, but I mean to find out before I'm much older. Meanwhile, here is something to keep you amused till the Statue of Liberty brings you your British tea. He dropped a paper onto Grant's chest. What is this? Grant said, looking at the torn-out page of a notebook. It's that letter of Richard's about Jane Shore. I'll be seeing you. Let alone by himself in the quiet, Grant turned over the page and read. The contrast between the sprawling, childish handwriting and the formal phrases of Richard's imaginings was piquant in the extreme. But what neither the untidy modern script nor the dignified phrases could destroy was the flavor of the letter, the bouquet of good humor that came up from the page as a bouquet comes up from a good-humored wine. Translated into modern terms, it said, I hear to my great astonishment that Tom Lynome wants to marry Will Shore's wife. Apparently he is infatuated with her and is quite determined about it. Do, my dear Bishop, send for him and see if you can talk some sense into his silly head. If you can't, and if there is no bar to their marriage from the Church's point of view, then I agree to it. But tell him to postpone the marriage till I am back in London. Meanwhile, this will suffice to secure her release on surety for her good behavior, and I suggest that you hand her over for the time being to the care of her father, or anyone else who seems good to you. It was certainly, as young Carradine had said, more in sorrow than in anger. Indeed, considering that it was written about a woman who had done him a deadly wrong, its kindness and good temper was remarkable. And this was a case where no personal advantage could come to him from magnanimity. The broad-mindedness that had sought for a York-Lancaster peace might not have been disinterested. It would have been enormously to his advantage to have a united country to rule. But this letter to the Bishop of Lincoln was a small private matter, and the release of Jane Shore of no importance to anyone but the infatuated Tom Lynome. Richard had nothing to gain by his generosity. His instinct to see a friend happy was apparently greater than his instinct for revenge. Indeed, his instinct for revenge seemed to be lacking to a degree that would be surprising in any red-blooded male, and quite astonishing in the case of that reputed monster, Richard III. Chapter 11. The letter lasted Grant very nicely until the Amazon brought his tea. He listened to the 20th century sparrows on his windowsill and marveled that he should be reading phrases that formed in a man's mind more than 400 years ago. What a fantastic idea it would have seemed to Richard that anyone would be reading that short, intimate letter about Shore's wife and wondering about him 400 years afterwards. "There's a letter for you. Now isn't that nice?" the Amazon said, coming in with his 2 pieces of bread and butter and a rock bun. Grant took his eyes from the uncompromising healthiness of the rock bun and saw that the letter was from Laura. He opened it with pleasure. "Dear Allan," said Laura, "nothing, repeat nothing, would surprise me about history. Scotland has large monuments to 2 women martyrs drowned for their faith, in spite of the fact that they weren't drowned at all, and neither was a martyr anyway. They were convicted of treason, 5th column work for the projected invasion from Holland, I think. Anyhow, on a purely civil charge. They were reprieved on their own petition by the Privy Council, and the reprieve is in the Privy Council register to this day. This, of course, hasn't daunted the Scottish collectors of martyrs, and the tale of their sad end, complete with heart-rending dialogue, is to be found in every Scottish bookcase. Entirely different dialogue in each collection. And the gravestone of one of the women in Wigtown churchyard reads, "Murdered for owning Christ supreme, head of his church, and no more crime, but her not owing prelacy, and not abjuring presbytery, within the sea tied to a stake, she suffered for Christ Jesus' sake." They are even a subject for fine Presbyterian sermons, I understand, though on that point I speak from hearsay. And tourists come and shake their heads over the monuments with their moving inscriptions, and a very profitable time is had by all. All this in spite of the fact that the original collector of the material, canvassing the Wigtown district only 40 years after the supposed martyrdom and at the height of the Presbyterian triumph, complains that many deny that this happened, and couldn't find any eyewitnesses at all. It is very good news that you are convalescent, and a great relief to us all. If you manage it well, your sick leave can coincide with the spring run. The water is very low at the moment, but by the time you are better, it should be deep enough to please both the fish and you. Love from us all, Laura. P.S. It's an odd thing, but when you tell someone the true facts of a mythical tale, they are indignant, not with the teller, but with you. They don't want to have their ideas upset. It rouses some vague uneasiness in them, I think, and they resent it, so they reject it and refuse to think about it. If they were merely indifferent, it would be natural and understandable, but it is so much stronger than that, much more positive. They are annoyed. Very odd, isn't it? More Tony Pandy, he thought. He began to wonder just how much of the school book, which up to now had represented British history for him, was Tony Pandy. He went back now, and he knew a few facts, to read the Sainted Moor again, to see how the relevant passages sounded now. If, when he had read them merely by the light of his own critical mind, they had seemed to him curiously tattling, and in places absurd, they now read plain abominable. He was what Laura's small Pat was in the habit of calling scunnered, and he was also puzzled. This was Morton's account. Morton, the eyewitness, the participant. Morton must have known with minute accuracy what took place between the beginning and end of June that year, and yet there was no mention of Lady Eleanor Butler, no mention of Titulus Regius. According to Morton, Richard's case had been that Edward was previously married to his mistress Elizabeth Lucy, but Elizabeth Lucy, Morton pointed out, had denied that she was ever married to the king. Why did Morton set up a 9-pin just to knock it down again? Why the substitution of Elizabeth Lucy for Elizabeth Butler? Because he could deny with truth that Lucy was ever married to the king, but could not do the same in the case of Eleanor Butler? Surely the presumption was that it was very important to someone or other that Richard's claim that the children were illegitimate should be shown to be untenable. And since Morton, in the handwriting of the Sainted Moor, was writing for Henry VII, then that someone was presumably Henry VII, the Henry VII who had destroyed Titulus Regius and forbidden anyone to keep a copy. Something Carradine had said came back into Grant's mind. Henry had caused the act to be repealed without being read. It was so important to Henry that the contents of the act should not be brought to mind that he had specially provided for its unquoted destruction. How should it be of such importance to Henry VII? How could it matter to Henry what Richard's rights were? It was not as if he could say Richard's claim was a trumped-up one, therefore mine is good. Whatever wretched small claim Henry Tudor might have was a Lancastrian one, and the heirs of York did not enter into the matter. Then why should it have been of such paramount importance to Henry that the contents of Titulus Regius should be forgotten? Why hide away Eleanor Butler and bring in her place a mistress whom no one ever suggested was married to the king? This problem lasted Grant very happily till just before supper, when the porter came in with a note for him. "The front hall says that young American friend of yours left this for ye," the porter said, handing him a folded sheet of paper. "Thank you," said Grant. "What do you know about Richard III?" "Is there a price?" "What for?" "The quiz." "No, just the satisfaction of intellectual curiosity. What do you know about Richard III?" "He was the first multiple murderer." "Multiple? I thought it was 2 nephews." "No, oh no, I don't know much about history, but I do know that. Murdered his brother and his cousin and the poor old king in the Tower, and then finished it off with his little nephews. A wholesale performer." Grant considered this. "If I told you that he'd never murdered anyone at all, what would you say?" "I'd say that you're perfectly entitled to your opinion. Some people believe the earth is flat. Some people believe the world is going to end in AD 2000. Some people believe that it began less than 5,000 years ago. You'll hear far funnier things than that at Marble Arch of a Sunday." "So you wouldn't even entertain the idea for a moment?" "I find it entertaining, all right, but not what you might call very plausible, shall we say. But don't let me stand in your way. Try it out on a better bombing range. You take it to the Marble Arch one Sunday, and I'll bet you'll find followers aplenty. Maybe you'll start a movement." He made a gay, sketchy half-salute with his hand and went away humming to himself, secure and impervious. So help me, Grant thought, I'm not far off it. If I get any deeper into this thing, I will be standing on a soapbox at Marble Arch. He unfolded the message from Carradine and read, "You said that you wanted to know whether the other heirs to the throne survived Richard. As well as the boys, I mean. I forgot to say, would you make out a list of them for me, so that I can look them up? I think it's going to be important." Well, if the world in general went on its humming way, brisk and uncaring, at least he had young America on his side. He put aside the Sainted Moor, with its Sunday paper accounts of hysterical scenes and wild accusations, and reached for the sober student's account of history, so that he might catalogue the possible rivals to Richard III in English succession. And as he put down More Morton, he was reminded of something. That hysterical scene during the council in the Tower, which was reported by More. The frantic outburst on Richard's part against the sorcery that had withered his arm had been against Jane Shore. The contrast between the reported scene, pointless and repellent even to a disinterested reader, and the kind, tolerant, almost casual air of the letter that Richard had actually written about her, was staggering. So help me, he thought again. If I had to choose between the man who wrote the account and the man who wrote that letter, I'd take the man who wrote the letter, whatever either of them had done besides. The thought of Morton made him postpone his listing of the York heirs until he found out what eventually became of John Morton. It seemed that, having used his leisure as Buckingham's guest to organize a joint Woodville-Lancastrian effort, in which Henry Tudor would bring ships and troops from France, and Dorset and the rest of the Woodville tribe would meet him with what English malcontents they could induce to follow them, he escaped to his old hunting ground in the Ely district, and from there to the continent, and did not come back until he came in the wake of a Henry who had won both Bosworth and a crown, being himself on the way to Canterbury and a cardinal's hat and immortality as Morton of Morton's Fork. Almost the only thing that any schoolboy remembered about his master, Henry VII. For the rest of the evening, Grant pottered happily through the history books, collecting heirs. There was no lack of them. Edward's 5, George's boy and girl, and if these were discounted, the first through illegitimacy and the second through attainder, there was another possible, his eldest sister, Elizabeth's boy. Elizabeth was Duchess at Suffolk, and her son was John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln. There was, too, in the family a boy whose existence Grant had not suspected. It appeared that the delicate child at Middleham was not Richard's only son. He had a love child, a boy called John of Gloucester, a boy of no importance in rank, but acknowledged and living in the household. It was an age when a bend sinister was accepted, without grief. Indeed, the Conqueror had made it fashionable, and conquerors from then on had advertised its lack of disadvantage, by way of compensation perhaps. Grant made himself a little aide-de-memoire. Edward, Elizabeth, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln. George, Edward, Earl of Warwick, Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, Richard, John of Gloucester, Edward, Prince of Wales, Richard, Duke of York, Elizabeth, Cicely, Anne, Catherine, Bridget. He copied it out again for young Carradine's use, wondering how it could ever have occurred to anyone, Richard most of all, that the elimination of Edward's 2 boys would have kept him safe from rebellion. The place was what young Carradine would call just lousy with heirs, swarming with focuses, or was it foci, for disaffection. It was brought home to him for the first time not only what a useless thing the murder of the boys would have been, but what a silly thing. And if there was anything that Richard of Gloucester was not, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it was silly. He looked up Oliphant to see what Oliphant had to say on this obvious crack in the story. "It is strange," said Oliphant, "that Richard does not seem to have published any version of their deaths." It was more than strange. It was incomprehensible. If Richard had wanted to murder his brother's sons, then he would most certainly have done it expertly. They would have died of a fever, and their bodies would have been exposed to the public gaze as royal bodies habitually were, so that all men would know that they were in fact departed from this life. No one can say that a man is incapable of murder. After long years on the embankment, Grant knew that only too well. But one can be sure to within one degree of the absolute when a man is incapable of silliness. Oliphant had no doubts about the murder, nevertheless. Richard, according to Oliphant, was Richard the Monster. Perhaps when a historian is covering a field as large as the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, he had no time to stop and analyze detail. Oliphant accepted the sainted more, even while he paused in flight to wonder at an oddity here and there, not seeing that the oddities ate away at the very foundation of his theory. Having Oliphant in his hand, he went on with Oliphant, on through the triumphal progress through England after the coronation. Oxford, Gloucester, Worcester, Warwick. No dissentient voice was recorded on that tour, only a chorus of blessing and thanksgiving, a rejoicing that good government was to be the order of the day for a lifetime to come. Then, that, after all, Edward's sudden death had not condemned them to years of faction and a new civil struggle over the person of his son. And yet it was during this triumph, this unanimous acclamation, this universal hosanna, that, according to Oliphant riding in the pocket of the sainted Moor, Richard sent Tyrrell back to London to make away with the boys, who were doing lessons in the Tower. Between July 7th and 15th, at Warwick, in the very summer of his safety, in the heart of the York country on the borders of Wales, he planned the destruction of 2 discredited children. It was a highly unlikely story. He began to wonder whether historians were possessed of minds any more commonsensical than those great minds he had encountered who had been so credulous. He must find out without delay why, if Tyrrell did that job in July 1485, he wasn't brought to book until 20 years afterwards. Where had he been in the meantime? But Richard's summer was like an April day, full of a promise that came to nothing. In the autumn, he had to face that Woodville Lancastrian invasion which Morton had cooked up before leaving the shores himself. The Lancastrian part of the affair did Morton proud, They came with a fleet of French ships and a French army, but the Woodville side could provide nothing better than sporadic little gatherings in widely separated centres. Guildford, Salisbury, Maidstone, Newbury, Exeter, and Brecon. The English wanted no part of Henry Tudor, whom they did not know, nor any part of the Woodvilles, whom they knew only too well. Even the English weather would have none of them, and Dorset's hopes of seeing his half-sister Elizabeth, Queen of England, as Henry Tudor's wife, was washed away in Severn floods. Henry tried to land in the west, but found Devon and Cornwall up in indignant arms at the idea. He therefore sailed away to France again to wait for a luckier day, and Dorset went to join the growing crowd of Woodville exiles hanging round the French court. So Morton's plan was washed away in autumn rain and English indifference, and Richard could be at peace for a little. But with the spring came a grief that nothing could wash away, the death of his son. The king is said to have shown signs of desperate grief. He was not such an unnatural monster as to be destitute of the feelings of a father, said the historian, nor of a husband, it seemed. The same marks of suffering were reported of him less than a year later, when Anne died. And after that there was nothing but the waiting for the renewal of the invasion that had failed, the keeping of England in a state of defence, and the anxiety that the drain on the exchequer brought him. He had done what good he could. He had given his name to a model parliament. He had made peace at last with Scotland, and arranged a marriage between his niece and James III's son. He had tried very hard for a peace with France, but had failed. At the French court was Henry Tudor, and Henry Tudor was France's white-headed boy. It would be only a matter of time before Henry landed in England, this time with better backing. Grant suddenly remembered Lady Stanley, that ardent Lancastrian mother of Henry. What part had Lady Stanley had in that autumn invasion that had put paid to Richard's summer? He hunted through the solid print until he found it. Lady Stanley had been found guilty of treasonable correspondence with her son. But again, Richard had proved too lenient for his own good, it seemed. Her estates were forfeit, but they were handed over to her husband, and so was Lady Stanley, for safe keeping. The bitter joke being that Stanley had almost certainly been as knowledgeable about the invasion as his wife. Truly, the monster was not running according to form. As Grant was falling asleep, a voice said in his mind, if the boys were murdered in July, and the Woodville-Lancastrian invasion took place in October, why didn't they use the murder of the children as a rallying call? The invasion had, of course, been planned before there was any question of murder. It was a full-dress affair of 15 ships and 5,000 mercenaries, and must have taken a long time to prepare. But by the time of the rising, the rumors of Richard's infamy must have been widespread, if there were any rumors at all. Why had they not gone shouting his crime through England, so that the horror of it brought men flooding to their cause?
Chapter 12. Cool off, he said to himself when he woke next morning. You're beginning to be partisan. That's no way to conduct an investigation. So, by way of moral discipline, he became prosecutor, supposing that the Butler story was a frame-up. A story concocted with Stillington's help, supposing that both lords and commons were willing to be hoodwinked in the hope of a stable government to come. Did that bring one any nearer the murder of the two boys? It didn't, did it? If the story were false, the person to be got rid of was Stillington. Lady Eleanor had died in her convent long ago, so was not there to blow Titulus Regius to pieces any time she had a mind. But Stillington could, and Stillington evidently showed no difficulty in going on living. He survived the man he had put on the throne. The sudden jar in the proceedings The abrupt break in the pattern of the coronation preparation was either wonderful stage manning or just what one would expect if the thunderclap of Stillington's confession descended upon unprepared ears. Richard was, what, 11, 12, when the Butler contract was signed and witnessed? It was unlikely that he knew anything of it. If the Butler story was an invention to oblige Richard, then Richard must have rewarded Stillington. But there was no sign of Stillington's being obliged with a cardinal's hat, or preferment, or office. But the surest evidence that the Butler story was true lay in Henry VII's urgent need to destroy it. If it were false, then all he had to do to discredit Richard was to bring it into the open and make Stillington eat his words. Instead, he hushed it up. At this point, Grant realized with disgust that he was back on the defense side again. He decided to give it up. He would take to Lavinia Fitch or Rupert Rouge or some other of the fashionable authors laying in such expensive neglect on his table, and forget Richard Plantagenet until such a time as young Carradine appeared to renew the Inquisition. He put the family tree sketch of Cicely Neville's grandchildren into an envelope and addressed it to Carradine, and gave it to the midget to post. Then he turned down the portrait that was leaning against the books, so that he could not be seduced by that face which Sergeant Williams had placed, without hesitation, on the bench, and reached for Silas Weekly's The Sweat and the Furrow. Thereafter he went from Silas's seamy wrestlings to Lavinia's teacups, and from Lavinia's teacups to Rupert's cavortings in the coulisses with growing dissatisfaction, until Brent Carradine once more turned up in his life. Carradine regarded him anxiously and said, "You don't look so bright as last time I saw you, Mr. Grant. You not doing so well?" "Not where Richard is concerned, I'm not," Grant said. "But I've got a new piece of Tony-pandy for you." And he handed him Laura's letter about the drowned women who were never drowned. Carradine read it with a delight that grew on him like slow sunlight coming out, until eventually he glowed. "My, but that's wonderful! That's very superior. First growth. Dyed-in-the-wool Tony-pandy, isn't it? Lovely, lovely! You didn't know about this before? And you're a Scotsman?" "I'm only a Scot once removed," Grant pointed out. "No, I knew that none of these Covenanters died for their faith. Of course, but I didn't know that one of them, or rather 2 of them, hadn't died at all." "They didn't die for their faith?" Carradine repeated, bewildered. "Do you mean the whole thing's Tony-pandy?" Grant laughed. "I suppose it is," he said, surprised. "I never thought about it before. I've known so long that the martyrs were no more martyrs than that thug who is going to his death for killing that old shopkeeper in Essex that I've ceased to think about it. No one in Scotland went to his death for anything but civil crime." "But I thought they were very holy people, the Covenanters, I mean." "You've been looking at 19th century pictures of conventicles. The reverent little gathering in the heather, listening to the preacher, young rapt faces, and white hair blowing in the winds of God. The Covenanters were the exact equivalent of the IRA in Ireland, a small, irreconcilable minority, and as bloodthirsty a crowd as ever disgraced a Christian nation. If you went to church on Sunday instead of to a conventicle, you were liable to wake on Monday and find your barn burned or your horses hamstrung. If you were more open in your disapproval, you were shot. The men who shot Archbishop Sharp in his daughter's presence in broad daylight on a road in Fife were the heroes of the movement, men of courage and zeal for the cause of God, according to their admiring followers. They lived safe and swaggering among their Covenanting fans in the West for years. It was a preacher of the gospel who shot Bishop Honeyman
in an Edinburgh street, and they shot the old parish priest of Carpsharn on his own doorstep. "It does sound like Ireland, doesn't it?" Carradine said. They were actually worse than the IRA because there was a fifth column element in it. They were financed from Holland, and their arms came from Holland. There was nothing forlorn about their movement, you know. They expected to take over the government any day and rule Scotland. All their preaching was pure sedition, the most violent incitement to crime you could imagine. No modern government could afford to be so patient with such a menace as the government of the time were. The governors were continually being offered amnesties. Well, well, and I thought they were fighting for freedom to worship God in their own way. No one ever stopped them from worshiping God any way they pleased. What they were out to do was to impose their method of church government not only on Scotland, but on England, believe it or not. You should read the Covenant some day. Freedom of worship was not to be allowed to anyone according to the Covenanting Creed, except the Covenanters, of course. And all those gravestones and monuments that tourists go to see. All Tonypandy. If you ever read on a gravestone that John Huset suffered death for his adherence to the Word of God and Scotland's coveted work of reformation, with a touching little verse underneath about dust sacrificed to tyranny, you can be sure that said John Huset was found guilty before a properly constituted court of a civil crime punishable by death, and that his death had nothing whatever to do with the Word of God. He laughed a little under his breath. It's the final irony, you know, that a group whose name was anathema to the rest of Scotland in their own time should have been elevated into the position of saints and martyrs. I wouldn't wonder if it wasn't onomatopoeic, Carradine said thoughtfully. What? Like the cat and the rat, you know. What are you talking about? Remember you said about that cat and rat lampoon, that rhyme, that the sound of it made it an offense? Yes, made it venomous. Well, the word dragoon does the same thing. I take it that the dragoons were just the policemen of the time. Yes, mounted infantry. Well, to me, and I suspect to every other person reading about it, dragoons sound dreadful. They've come to mean something that they never were. Yes, I see. Force majeure in being. Actually, the government only had a tiny handful of men to police an enormous area, so the odds were all on the Covenanters' side, in more ways than one. A dragoon, read policeman, couldn't arrest anyone without a warrant. He couldn't stable his horse without the owner's permission, if it came to that. But there was nothing to hinder a Covenanter lying snug in the heather and picking off dragoons at his leisure, which they did, of course. And now there's a whole literature about the poor ill-used saint in the heather with his pistol, and the dragoon who died in the course of his duty is a monster. Like Richard. Like Richard. How have you been getting on with our own particular Tonypandy? Well, I still haven't managed to find out why Henry was so anxious to hush up that act as well as repeal it. The thing was hushed up, and for years it was forgotten, until the original draft turned up just by chance in the Tower records. It was printed in 1611. Speed printed the full text of it in his History of Great Britain. Oh, so there's no question at all about Titulus Regius. Richard succeeded, as the act says, and the sainted Moore's account is nonsense. There never was an Elizabeth Lucy in the matter. Lucy? Who's Elizabeth Lucy? Oh, I forgot. You weren't on in that act. According to the sainted Moore, Richard claimed that Edward was married to one of his mistresses, one Elizabeth Lucy. The disgusted look that the mention of the sainted Moore always caused on young Carradine's mild face made him look almost nauseated. That's nonsense! So the sainted Moore smugly pointed out. Why did they want to hide Eleanor Butler?
Carradine said, seeing the point. Because she really had married Edward, and the children really were illegitimate. And if the children really were illegitimate, by the way, then no one would rise in their favor, and they were no danger to Richard. Have you noticed that the Woodville Lancastrian invasion was in Henry's favor, and not in the boys', although Dorset was their half-brother? And that was before any rumors of their non-existence could have reached him. As far as the leaders of the Dorset-Wharton rebellion were concerned, the boys were of no account. They were backing Henry. That way, Dorset would have a brother-in-law on the throne of England, and the Queen would be his half-sister, which would be a nice reversal of form for a penniless fugitive. Yes, that's a point all right. That about Dorset not fighting to restore his half-brother. If there had been a chance at all that England would have accepted the boy, he surely would have backed the boy. I'll tell you another interesting thing I found. The Queen and her daughters came out of sanctuary quite soon. It's your talking about her son Dorset that reminded me. She not only came out of sanctuary, but settled down as if nothing had happened. Her daughters went to festivities at the palace, and do you know what the payoff is? No. That was after the princes had been murdered. Yeah, and I'll tell you something else. With her 2 boys done to death by their wicked uncle, she writes to her other son in France, Dorset, and asks him to come home and make his peace with Richard, who will treat him well. There was silence. There were no sparrows to talk today, only the soft sound of the rain against the window. No comment? Carradine said at last. You know, Grant said, from the police point of view, there is no case against Richard at all, and I mean that literally. It isn't that the case isn't good enough to bring into court, I mean. There quite literally isn't any case against him at all. I say there isn't, especially when I tell you that every single one of those people whose names you sent me were alive and prosperous and free when Richard was killed at Bosworth. They were not only free, they were very well cared for. Edward's children not only danced at the palace, they had pensions. He appointed one of the crowd his heir when his own boy died. Which one? George's boy. So, he meant to reverse the attainder on his brother's children. Yeah, he had protested about his being condemned, if you remember. According to even the sainted More, he did. So all the heirs to the throne of England were going about their business, free and unfettered, during the reign of Richard III, the Monster. They were more. They were part of the general scheme of things. I mean, part of the family and the general economy of the realm. I've been reading a collection of York records by a man Davies. Records of the town of York, I mean, not the family. Both young Warwick, George's son, and his cousin, young Lincoln, were members of the council. The town addressed a letter to them. In 1485, that was. What's more, Richard knighted young Warwick at the same time as he knighted his own son, at a splendid do in York. He paused a long moment and then blurted out, Mr. Grant, do you want to write a book about this? A book? Grant said, astonished. God forbid. Why? Well, because I should like to write one. It would make a much better book than The Peasants. Right away. You see, I'd like to have something to show my father. Pops thinks I'm no good because I can't take an interest in furniture and marketing and graphs of sales. If he could actually handle a book that I had written, he might believe that I wasn't so hopeless a bet after all. In fact, I wouldn't put it past him to begin to boast about me for a change. Grant looked at him with benevolence. I forgot to ask you what you thought of Crosby Place, he said. Oh, fine. If Carradine III ever sees it, he'll want to take it back with him and rebuild it in the Adirondacks somewhere. If you write that book about Richard, he most certainly will. He'll feel like a part owner. What are you going to call it? The book? Yes. I'm going to borrow a phrase from Henry Ford and call it History is the Bunk. Excellent. However, I'll have a lot more reading to do and a lot more research before I can start writing. Most assuredly you have. You haven't arrived yet at the real question. And what is that? Who did murder the boys? Oh, yes, of course. If the boys were alive when Henry took over the tower, what happened to them? Yeah, I'll get on to that. I still want to know why it was so important to Henry to hush up the contents of Titulus Regius. He got up to go, and then noticed the portrait that was lying on its face on the table. He reached over and restored the photograph to its original place, propping it with a concerned care against the pile of books. You stay there, he said to the painted Richard. I'm going to put you back where you belong. As he went out of the door, Grant said, I've just thought of a piece of history which is not Tony-pandy. Yes? Said Carradine, lingering. The massacre of Glencoe. That really did happen? That really did happen. And Brent put his head back inside the door. Yes? The man who gave the order for it was an ardent Covenanter. And that is where we are going to leave it for today. If you like what I do here, please like, subscribe, check the button, hit the bell, do the thing. Share me with all your friends, get me out there. And otherwise, I'll be seeing you guys next time. Bye!